I just got a lot closer. Okay, welcome everyone to our last talk of the semester. It's not our last talk of the year, and I want to make sure that everyone knows we will be having virtual events in the spring, and you can find our calendar of events as we get them scheduled on our website. But we're really delighted that you can join us and that Professor Lieberman can join us virtually today. Professor Anatoly Liberman probably needs no introduction, but I do want to introduce him as a professor in the Department of German, Nordic, Slavic, and Dutch here at the University of Minnesota. Approaching the end of the 45th year of teaching the campus. For several years in a row, his talks have marked the completion of the fall semester at the Center for Medieval Studies. This meeting follows the same tradition, except that, alas, there will be no reception afterward. Anatoly is still the same, a student of historical linguistics, myths, and folklore, and the golden age of Russian poetry, as well as an active critic of contemporary Russian literature. In 2020, he finished work on the book titled "Take My Word for It," an explanatory and etymological dictionary of English idioms from Adam's ale to zoot suit. He hopes that the book will be on the publisher's desk before the end of December and is wondering whether next time, and he hopes that there will be a next time, a talk on idioms might fit the agenda of the Center for Medieval Studies. But today he will stay with myths and folklore and speak about the gods who are animals. So with that, I will introduce Professor Lieberman, and we will take comments and questions after the talk. You can put those into the chat and I can pass them on to Professor Lieberman. All right, great.
All right, thank you, Michelle. It's a strange experience, though during this semester, I have given several Zoom talks, and of course I teach using Zoom, and it's not quite unusual and not so exotic in December as it was at the beginning of the semester, but it's still strange to see a screen with my own face there and only the numbers there. It's no longer, I say, so exotic, but every time it happens, I wonder whether everyone really is there, where everyone hears me, or whether I'm in my senility talking to myself and enjoying my own talk. Well, in any case, I hope that everything will go well. And I'll be happy to answer questions and use our traditional way of discussion. The subject which I offered, and I offered it to Michelle Hamilton a year ago, was not a chance idea. It didn't just occur to me that it would be nice to speak about animals now than people behave in such a beastly way, but because I have been working on this subject for many years, for several decades. Working doesn't mean that that I have been trying to discover something absolutely new and absolutely unusual, but very many crumbs have been assembled together so that there is a small pie, and this pie I'm going to discuss today. That animals and human beings, or gods, doesn't really matter as long as they're anthropomorphic, that they're all together, that they interact is something that everyone has known forever. The question is, what kind of traces we find in our myths, especially in Scandinavian myths, which are closer to me than any other part of world mythology and in folklore, and also why animals play such a strange role in all myths. It seems that it is the most natural thing in the world. Well, of course, there are animals there, and why shouldn't we discuss them? But if we look at everything, a bird's eye view, if I can say so, if we look at the animals in world literature, in folklore and in myths, we find that domestic animals play no role whatsoever. And people must have been surrounded by domestic animals for a long, long time. Domesticated dogs and even cats and so on. But these are not the animals which we see. What we see is one point, one thing that I would like to discuss in my talk. That is the strange ability of human beings becoming beasts and animals. And that is really the point of my talk, and that's the point of the whole the idea behind it. If we look back, we find that animals and gods and goddesses, all kinds of deities, that they I'm distracted a bit because I constantly see the computer transcribing my speech and making funny mistakes, details instead of deities and so on. But you know what I'm talking about because you can hear me and not only looking at the screen. So if we look back, the first civilization about which we have enough information from this point of view and from practically any other point of view is Egypt. And in Egypt, we find that half, even more than half of the gods can become beasts. And it's not even correct to say that they become beasts. They're half beast, half human beings. And that is, when you come to think of it, surprising, because why should it be so? Here are some examples, and I will be constantly using the word theriomorphic, which is not as common as the word anthropomorphic, because anthropomorphic is something that everybody knows, being shaped like a human being, and theriomorphic from two Greek words, animal and human being. Theriomorphic means in the form of an animal or a beast. And we find that there is a union and a very important union between the gods and animals. Here is a very short list, and I will not go into any details, but into detail in general. But look at what has happened. We know, fortunately, we have statuettes and of Egyptian deities, of gods and goddesses, unlike what we have from, for example, from Scandinavia, where the few things excavated do not give us any insights into the topic I have chosen for my today's presentation. But from Egypt, we have all of them as though they stood before us. Here is the greatest of them, of the most noticeable of them, Anubis, which has a jackal's head. He is the god of the underworld, but they're polyfunctional gods, and they do very many things. Not only that they're gods of something, and when I say that he's the underworld, it's not quite true, because he's also one of the gods of the sky and one of the gods of war. They all were really gods of war. And then there is perhaps the best known of them, Horus, who is baboon-headed, and he is a god, or the god of vengeance. I don't think there are any other Egyptian gods. And the moment we begin to think of it, it becomes clear that we don't quite understand the connection. For example, why jackal and why baboon? What is so important about a baboon that the theriomorphic god will be a god of vengeance? Then there is someone who is spelled T-H-O-T-H, And there are two pronunciations of the name. Some people pronounce it in the English way, Thoth, but I've heard it from those who are specialists in Egyptian mythology. I heard only the pronunciation Thoth without any H, and I think it's better to say it this way. So he was baboon-headed, and there was also Horus, who was Tatun was Thoth was a baboon-headed god, not Horus, as I said. Then there was a god who was ox-eyed, and that is something that we'll remember later. And there was Geb, G-E-B, who had, that is the most puzzling of them all. He had a goose on his head, always shown with a goose on his head. And why he should have a goose is totally unclear, because he's a god of wisdom. And it's not known that geese are the wisest creatures in the world. And yes, that's what we find there. Now, when we go from that to Greece, these are already very well-known situations. We find Zeus, who has an eagle, and though Zeus is not half god, half eagle, but he is inseparable from him. Athena has an owl. Artemis has a doe, D-O-E, and they are always together in all the statues that we have in Greece. Almost all the statues which I've looked at, Artemis has a doe. Then there is, of course, a famous myth about Actaeon, how the poor hunter by chance saw Artemis swimming. She was bathing, she was naked, and no one was allowed to look at her without clothes, because she was a virgin goddess. And the vengeful goddess turned Actaeon into a stag, and he was torn to pieces by his own hounds. This image is very well known from numerous sculptures, and it was a favorite picture by Renaissance painters. So that's and there is one god, one Egyptian god, whom I'll leave for the future, because that will be the culmination of my talk. There was Hecht, who was a frog god, and this frog god is probably one of the most important characters in my today's talk. The question, it seems natural. It's so familiar. Yes, well, yes, that's how it was. They were half gods, goddesses, and half animals. I don't think that anyone has ever asked the most natural question: why should there have been such theomorphic gods? That they are discussed everywhere. Any book on Egyptian and Greek mythology invariably discusses these deities. What is not discussed, as I say, is why our ancient ancestors needed such creatures. If someone among those listening to me can answer this question, I'll be very grateful. But in the many books that I have looked at and through, I couldn't find the answer. I think the answer is this. First of all, at what stage of development, of mythic development or societal development, when did it become necessary to have such gods? I think there's only one question. One must deal with a hunting society in order to have such wild beasts for anyone, really, from jackals to baboons and anyone. Here was ox-eyed and eagles and anyone, all those animals. I think that only hunter-gatherers, and that's the most primitive state of any economy known in the world. I think that only such hunter-gatherers could invent myths dealing with half gods, half beasts. And if it is so, then my explanation probably will not sound too exotic or even rather natural. While dealing with animals, with wild animals in the jungle, in forests, everywhere, one naturally crossed the line between the hunter and the hunted. That line is not known too well, but it has been noticed. For example, when Beowulf, and I'm deviating from my subject, when Beowulf fights his monsters, Grendel and Grendel's mother, the same old English word, Eilaka, is used about both the monster and Beowulf. If you fight beasts, you become a beast. In cruelty, in vigor, in courage, use any word you want. But that's the most important thing. You are part of the world in which your adversary and you, the hunter, are really equal. And that is, I think, how those gods, demi-beasts, if I can coin such a word, how they appeared and how they became so famous. Of course, as time went on, these gods became stylized. And as time went on and hunter-gatherers gave way to a more advanced type of economy, one no longer needed such gods. That is why we find Zeus having an eagle as his servant. And that is why Athena can send an owl, her owl, as her servant. But the line was still easily crossed because all those gods and goddesses, all, of course, is a wrong word, but many of the gods and goddesses about whom we know a good deal from the extant stories, from those tales which are Greek, Egyptian, Roman myths, we know how these gods and goddesses, if necessary, turn into animals. They are not half human beings or anthropomorphic beings and half theriomorphic beings. They are much more than that. They turn into anyone they want. Zeus is especially famous from this point of view. He can turn into anything, absolutely anything, including sunlight, not an animal, but that is just to show that the line was crossed in such a way that people didn't understand what they were talking about. But turning into a swan in order to win a beautiful maiden, that was something that he did without any trouble. And it's not clear where the line was crossed and how ancient these myths were, but that they became formulaic, that at a certain time it was simply possible to invent a myth in which a great god or a great goddess turned him, herself, or herself into an animal. This simply became a figure of speech. One didn't need any mythology for that. There was Zeus who could turn, or Jupiter later, who could turn himself into any deity, into any god or goddess. But we're interested in the beginning, in the earlier stages of this development. And at that stage, we find, I think that's a very ancient figure, we find Greek Pan, who, of course, panic has the root of Pan's name, who is half goatish in shape. If we want to reconstruct the way mythology developed, or thinking development, or thought development, I think that's the earliest stage, the hunting stage, the stage of hunter-gatherers, who, while chasing wild beasts, did not separate themselves from their prey. They were really became half beasts and half and half human beings. Also, they needed such gods because they could be lost, and were very often lost, overpowered by the beasts, and they need protectors. And these half gods, half beasts were excellent protectors. They were both, they combined the features of both, and they could be good and friendly. And that is what it meant to be, to have the protection of such deities. Pan is already half god, half beast. He only has feet and part of the legs that are goatish. And of course, satyrs are also half human beings and half animals. So that's the next stage. It's no longer a naive stage in art, but in life, I think that's exactly how it developed. First, real gods who were both anthropomorphic and theriomorphic. Then somehow a concession to logic. We know that there are no such creatures in the world around us. So let them be half animal, half human being. And then finally a fairy tale, or simply a folk tale, better than a fairy tale, a folk tale in which any god can turn into any animal. And that is what we find in Egypt and Greece and Rome. Rome is not so important because Roman myths are a weak echo or weak echoes of what we find in Greece. Now one step over, going to Scandinavia. Scandinavian myths are ancient and primitive, but we only have them from 13th century texts, even though the texts themselves are certainly much older. So what do we find there? Some of the examples are truly important. We usually find that gods and animals are in some way associated. Some examples are known very well. I think the most famous example is Odin, who can turn himself, if necessary, into a snake, and does that in order to perform his most important feat. But more important than that, we don't know much about his reptile features, but we know something that is much more important. He is inseparable from his horse, and his horse is Sleipnir. And here is something, a bit of Old Icelandic that is necessary. One of the words that is known to very many people, even those who are not specialists in Scandinavian mythology, is Yggdrasil. Y-G-G-D-R-A-S-S-I-L. S-I-L-L. Yggdrasil. Or in the pronunciation of modern pronunciation, in modern Icelandic, then Yggdrasil. That is a word that has been discussed many times, and this is not a clear name. It's usually explained in our popular books on mythology that Yggdrasil is the great tree, and then all kinds of accretions, all kinds of myths connected with this tree. Some reconstructed myths are absolute nonsense. That is, nothing happened the way modern scholars reconstructed it. But I think that one reconstruction is correct. First of all, the name has two forms, Yggdrasil or Ygg-S-Drasil, so Yggs-Drasil. And I think that Yggdrasil is correct. When I say that I think so, it's not just my idea or my reconstruction. There is a good deal of literature behind it. and all contradictory. There are as many opinions as there are scholars. And some of the scholars are old, some of them are contemporary, our contemporaries who live in Scandinavia today. But I think one of the oldest reconstructions of Yggdrasil is the best. I think Yggdrasil is really Ig or Ug, whichever pronunciation you want, modern or Old Icelandic. Yggdrasil was really Yggdrasil without any S in the middle. And I'll only repeat what I think is the best reconstruction of this. Ug seems to be the name of the god, and that is something that everyone accepts. Ug means terrible, terrifying, and Drasil is a horse. But if you have S in the middle, the name will mean that it is the tree of the god, the horse of the god, but it's not the horse of the god. I think those who thought that it was Yggdrasil were correct. At one time, there is enough evidence that Odin was a theriomorphic god, and the animal that interests us is a horse. That's not quite an animal that you would probably expect from a hunter, not from a hunting society. But then there was a model. People thought of gods as being half beasts, half human beings, and or half animals. And Odin, who in the most ancient myth was the leader of the wild chase, that is a parade of dead bodies, was a rider. He was a rider in all his incarnations. And it's not for nothing that one of the most ancient myths of Scandinavia is about the birth of his horse. And this horse itself, and that is an aspect which is practically never emphasized. The name of the horse is a stallion. I say horse, but it's really a stallion. Was Sleipnir, S-L-E-P-N-I-R. I have to spell out everything instead of giving you handouts, but let's wait for another semester when we're all together in one room, and then there will be PowerPoints and handouts. So Sleipnir, Sleipnir himself, itself, whatever you want, Sleipnir was itself a strange creature, born to a mare and a god. The god was Loki, the famous god Loki. And though Sleipnir is really a beast, though a mythic beast with 8 legs instead of 4. Again, a lot has been said about why 8 legs, but I think the easiest explanation, Occam's razor here, is the best. 8 legs run faster than 4 legs. So I think it's better to have a horse like Sleipnir than a usual horse. And Sleipnir is really half man, half horse. Loki is the father. Loki, of course, had to turn himself into a stallion, but that's an inevitable trick. But it's practically a hybrid. And Sleipnir is then a hybrid. And Odin, I think, was a hybrid. And that is something that is not very well known, something that you will never find in our popular books. In addition to that, there were other gods who I think were of the same type. One of them was Freyr, F-R-E-Y-R, who was probably also a stallion, because we don't have any myth like the wonderful myth of Sleipnir, but we have one of the sagas, which is a saga known better to any student of Old Icelandic than any other, because it was included in a popular book of Old Norse in Gordon's introduction. It's the saga of Hrafnkel, and Hrafnkel, H-R-A-F-N-K-E-L-L, Hrafnkel. And in the saga of Hrafnkel, there is a semi-magical horse called Freyfaxi. Faxi, F-A-X-I. Faxi means mane, M-A-N-E. And Frey is Frey. It's not Freyr, it's Freyfaxi. And it's never understood correctly. Never is an exaggeration. It has been understood correctly, but very seldom, and very seldom has any conclusions been drawn from this fact. Freyfaxi is like Yggdrasil. It's not a horse belonging to Frey. It's Frey in his capacity of a horse. If it was necessary to say that someone belonged or something belonged to Frey, S was in the middle, as in a Gothe is a priest, as in Frey's Gothe. If Hrapnkel, the owner of that horse, wanted to say that it was something belonging to Frey, he would have said Frey's Faxi, but he said Frey Faxi. And that is what he was, and that's why he was so important to Hrapnkel. He was worshipped because he was an incarnation of God Freyr. So here's Odin, who I think was half horse, half stallion, that is, half stallion and half God. Here is Freyr, who is again half stallion, half God. We don't have any indication in any myth, but the way he could be turned into a divine horse in a saga tells volumes. Well, Loki is not very typical because Loki can turn himself into practically anything, from a snake to a fly. But the line is very easy to cross. Then there is Thor, the great god Thor, T-H-O, and as many R's as you want. 2 if you want it to be Icelandic, 1 if you want it to be anglicized. So here is Thor. And nothing is known about Thor along the lines I'm pursuing. He has goats, of course, though they are not very important in Thor's mythology. There is only one very important myth, and I'll skip it because it's not the myth itself that is important to me here. If he was a thunder god, he must have had a horse, and his chariot must have been horse-driven. I think here is another theoremorphic god. We don't have any evidence that he had a horse, but there is a strange word which I discussed in great detail in one of my older publications, and I'll only mention it briefly here. Thor is called Hlorrithi, H-L-O-R-R-I-T-H-I. He was Hlorrithi, and Rithi is probably rider, though knows it for sure whether it is so, but it looks so. Hlor is some animal name. It's a very long story, and I won't even try to discuss this story today because it's all etymology from beginning to end, and it's very hard to discuss it in an oral presentation. But it's undoubtedly some animal name. I think that it was really a pig's name rather than any other name. And pigs were so very important, as we know from Freyr, from Frigg, who was really a pig deity, and pigs were constantly associated with her. The story of Frey is different, and I'll skip it here. Pigs, horses, everything returns us to the same. Now, don't be misled by the word pig. I say pig, but I really mean boar, B-O-A-R. And boars play an outstanding role in Viking mythology. They indeed did not have the helmets that we are very fond of observing in our textbooks. They never had those helmets, but boars were their main beasts of vigor. And if Thor at one time indeed was half boar and half god, fine. We would like to have a horse if he had a chariot, and a chariot he had. But the chariot was strangely enough driven by goats. Never mind where we find ourselves in the zoo. And the important thing is that wherever we look, we find that the persona of a god and a goddess is inseparable from some beast. And especially such epithets as Hera, Greek. Hera was ox-eyed. That is something that cannot be shaken off. Apparently, her bovine past is beyond doubt. So that's the story. As I think it developed into in several sentences, and then I'll go on to the last part of my presentation, which is not about beasts, but about frogs, because I promised to leave my frog god Hecht in Egypt for dessert. And so here is something then the thesis that I want to make, either for questions or for discussions or for acceptance, but for any kind of consideration. Hunter-gatherers, and I really mean hunters, though it's always hunter-gatherers. Hunter-gatherers associated themselves, identified themselves with beasts, as the prey they hunted. And their gods were like themselves. And that is inseparable from human beings and inseparable from beasts. I think that's how it all started. Then the story began to develop. If I can stay with my animal metaphor, I would remind you of Kipling's Mowgli. The great panther Bagheera once heard someone's gossip or story and remarked dryly, "The tale has lost no fat in the telling." A very good metaphor from a panther. The same with myths. They lost no fat. Those tales lost no fat in the telling. And those ancient venerable gods developed more or less into characters, into the characters of other stories. And the last step in this story was how human beings and animals or beasts could play leapfrog. And it's the frog that will interest me at the moment. There is a strange, of course, everything that was myths ended up and deteriorated in modern folklore. And let us not take the word modern too seriously. That is in the folklore that we know to be modern. It's not really modern. It was very often early medieval, or at least pre-modern. So what about the frogs in this folklore? Several things are amazing. There is a Eurasian folk tale about an animal spouse, and this is a very common story, Beauty and the Beast, more or less, though this is the last stage of the tale's degradation. And in that, an animal spouse is very common in all folk tales. That doesn't surprise me too much. As long as you have bears and wolves and all kinds of beasts in that function, why not have an animal spouse who invariably turns into a prince? Some of the oldest tales do not have princes at the end. One of the greatest stories is from Latvia, where there is a garden snake, and those garden snakes, strangely, they're probably more eels than garden snakes. They live at the bottom of the sea, and the human bride lives with and is very happy with this animal in human form at the bottom of the sea. That is what happened with all kinds of sea princesses and so on. But the frog story is important because it's certainly not a chance plot. And that's the last thing I wanted to discuss. There are two stories that are known. One is good and one is hopelessly bad. The good story is the Russian one, where the hero of the tale, this is already a wonder tale, a real fairy tale. So the last stage of development or degradation, depending on how you want to define it, where the hero is told to find a bride, by shooting an arrow. The hero shoots an arrow. Yes, the idea is that the arrow will land in a place where the bride will present herself. And his arrow ends up in a swamp, and he sees a frog jumping up with his arrow in its mouth. And this frog turns out to be an enchanted princess, of course. I'll skip the whole story. The story is excellent because it's developed very well. It has two parts. In general, it's a very good tale. It has a tragic middle when the prince burns the frog's skin one day before the frog was destined to become a human being, and the bride turns herself into a bird, flies away, and the second half is about how he's going to regain her. That's a very common plot. But the frog, such a very strange creature, really, when you come to think of it. How could it happen? And one would have said that that's one of the quirks of Slavic folklore. But the Grimms knew two versions. One is, for some incomprehensible reason, tale number one in the collection. It's a poorly told tale. It's a very unconvincing story about the princess, a princess who drops her spindle, her golden ring into a well, and the ring comes back to her in the mouth of a frog. And this is a very lascivious frog. It wants to sleep in the princess's room, and the princess is made to do so, and then in disgust takes the frog, because the frog really wants to be, encroaches on her bed, and smashes the frog against the wall, and lo and behold, the frog turns into an enchanted prince. That's a hopelessly stupid story, except for the beginning, which goes back clearly to some ancient tradition. There is another story. Those of you who have a full book, a book of the Grimms by Jack Zipes, it has a very important section called Stories Not Included in Later Editions. And there is a story called The Lion and the Frog. Again, both the lion and the frog turned out to be enchanted creatures. So the frog, how could it happen that the frog became the hero or the heroine of such stories? I think the distinction between hero and heroine is entirely due to grammar. The German word for frog is masculine. The English one is, the Russian one is feminine. That's why in the Russian story, the frog is a princess. And in the German story, it's the prince. If someone in the audience wants the real words, it's der Frosch in German, and it's Legushka in Russian. So the sex, the gender, as we now always say, the sex of the bride or bridegroom, the spouse, is insignificant. It's the story itself that is important. How could it be that we have this story? That is my reconstruction. I think the only country, the only land, not country, perhaps better to say, the only land that can give any explanation is ancient Egypt. And that's why I said that I would leave Hecht, the frog, deity as the culmination of my story to make my point especially clearly. In Egypt, frogs were all important because after the flooding of their fields in spring, when the Nile flooded the fields, millions, not thousands, but millions of frogs appeared there. And the frogs became a symbol of fertility. In general, if you look at the mythology of all nations, you find that the earliest stage of every deity is fertility. There is really nothing but producing offspring in our lives. And that is why fertility is everywhere. But frogs are not a symbol, but the very picture of procreation and fertility. So the story of a frog god, if you want, or frog prince must have originated in Egypt. And we understand how. Not here a hunting society, but a society of agriculturists already. But then hunters or peasants in the European sense of the word, all the same, they depended on the crops. And if the Nile stopped flooding their fields, all of them would have been dead. So the veneration of the frog doesn't even depend on the type of their economy, regardless of how it all started in the development of the world. When Egypt was conquered by Greece, nothing much changed in Greece as is known. And Egypt was Hellenized in a rather superficial way, but many stories became known. And we know that the Greeks, of course, I don't have any evidence for Hect, unfortunately, but we know that Egyptian deities were venerated in Greece on a par with their own. There were even temples to some of them. And clearly the frog myth must have become known in Greece. And if it was known in Greece, it certainly became known in Rome. That is all reconstruction. There is nothing I can say to prove this step. In historical linguistics, when a form is certain but reconstructed but hasn't been attested, they put an asterisk before it. So that's an asterisk frog in my story. Undoubtedly from Egypt to Greece, and from Greece to Rome, and from Rome then to post-Roman Western Europe. That's the way then of all those theoremorphic creatures, from the venerated deities of hunting societies, from those who were half beast, half human beings, from human beings who didn't distinguish themselves from their prey, to helpful animals like the eagle of Zeus and like the owl of Athena, and to all the helpful animals in our folk tales. You will remember how very often the hero travels all over the world, and all over the world he finds suffering animals and helps them. He throws a fish into the river or into the sea. He helps a wounded hare, and so on. And then at the last moment, they come all together to help the hero. I have never found a single work discussing the origin of this motif, helpful animals. I think helpful animals belong to my story, and with the characters I have discussed. They must have been part of those ancient hunting societies, the mythology of those hunting societies, when animals were both enemies or prey, probably a better word than enemies, and not only prey, but helpful in some way. They helped them survive, because one could kill an animal and live on its meat, or follow the tracks. That is, animals were really helpful. Then it all traveled and traveled and traveled until we have it all in a state of utter degradation in folk tales. So that's the beginning and that's the end. Gods were first beasts and animals. Then heroes sometimes couldn't distinguish themselves from their adversaries, from their rivals whom they had to kill. And then it went on and on until we find the fairy tale or folk tales in which, strangely, domestic animals almost never function. That's the last step. And that is what I wanted to tell you about the gods who were animals and how those animals made their way through the folklore of Western Europe. Thank you very much. And the initial idea was that I would speak for about 45 or 50 minutes and leave some time for questions and comments. And that is the next step in our meeting.
Wonderful. Thank you, Professor Anatoly. That was a wonderful talk. And I'm so glad that you were able to join us virtually this year, even though it's not the same. And I am checking chat to see if anyone has any comments or questions for Professor Liberman, who has laid out this trajectory of the development of how the stories that we're maybe are familiar with from Grimm's fairy tales or Disney, right, reach back into history. Trying to think. I don't see comments yet. I have one. Someone asked if there will be a place to view this recording after we conclude the talk, and we I think are planning to put the recordings of the talks that we've had at the center on our YouTube channel. So, and Professor Liberman has graciously allowed us to record the talk. So. And I know you ended with a frog, which makes me think of this movie, the Disney movie, The Princess and the Frog, that came out fairly recently, that at least during my kids' lifetime that we watched, which I think is associated with the American South. So that seems to bring it even closer to our time period.
I have a question.
Okay. This is Michael Friedrich.
Yeah.
Okay.
Professor Liberman, you didn't mention the ravens in the context of Odin, and I was curious why the omission.
I don't think it's even an omission when it comes to that, because that's an entirely different part of my story, which does belong to it. And that is the story of the creation of the world and the way our earth was put together. And that is why you have never heard anything about coyotes or ravens as we know them from many American myths. And the reason why I didn't mention it, that I wanted to have such stories, stories in which both human beings were half beasts, half men and women. And coyotes and ravens remain their sweet selves in those stories. They're just ravens and coyotes. So I skipped all trickster tales of this type, and especially all creation tales. That would have, if I had mentioned that, that would have taken me too far afield. And I didn't want to turn my talk into a story of the role of animals and beasts in folklore and mythology. And that is why I didn't mention them. But the point is well taken. They certainly belong here, but in a somewhat different capacity, as far as I understand.
Great. Okay, I have a question from Maggie Heeshan, who wants to know if you have any ideas about why Norse gods seem to be connected with domesticated animals, the horse, in the examples that you gave, but Egyptian and Greek gods are not associated with domestic animals.
I don't think I have ever read a myth about a truly domesticated animal. Domesticated animals are very common in folk tales, but they're just animal tales. And like the musicians of Bremen, for example, or the tales of cats and dogs, etiological tales of why dogs and cats are enemies. Those are probably eternal. And again, this is somewhat a path away from what I meant for my presentation. I wanted only those characters who were both anthropomorphic and theriomorphic. And in such tales, as in the previous, in my answer to the previous tales, ravens are ravens and coyotes are always coyotes. They do not turn into anyone. If I could find a South American god with a coyote on his head, like that goose, that would have been great, but we don't find it. So animal tales are a special chapter in world folklore, and that was not part of what I wanted to speak about. And I don't think there are any myths about how animals were domesticated. The only myth that I know was created by Kipling, the famous story about the cat that walked by himself. It would be lovely to find such a story in real mythology. I can't imagine any. And when I have folk tales, I always notice that cats are evil, and evil very often turn out to be witches and so on. But those are not myths. These are folk tales of a different type, and they may be as ancient as those. But all our ancient gods, of course, once they were demoted, those gods, they turned into devils of all kinds. So this is what happened to the so-called lower mythology. And that's why I did not say anything about them. It was not a talk about the role of animals in mythology, but only one corner was illuminated.
Great, thank you. I have a couple more questions. I have a question from Paul Peterson, who wonders if you think that the ancient people who turned natural abstractions, nature, into animal helpers were also aware of themselves as animals. In other words, is the creation of the beast gods also an outward reflection of ourselves as human beings?
Well, first of all, I want to say hello to Paul Peterson, who is not only someone who is asking a question, but an old student at Minnesota, a graduate student, a successful teacher, and an old friend. So first of all, I want to say hello. Secondly, if Paul wants to know something about the self-awareness of ancient people, he will not get an answer, because how on earth can we know anything about them? But I think that he has a point, that yes, those who were at the earliest stage of civilization did not draw any clear line between human beings and animals. And that is what we know, not from our European myths, but mainly from the stories that I have read by anthropologists. One of the stories which Paul may have even heard in one of my lectures, and others have not, so I will repeat it, is about an anthropologist trying to convince, I don't remember, I think it's somewhere in Africa, trying to convince people that monkeys and human beings are really different. And he said, well, look, monkeys never speak, and we do. But the answer was absolutely unbeatable. Yes, because they're so smart, they won't speak in our presence. And there is no way of beating the wisdom of this answer. I'm sure that the question has a very important rational grain in it. At a certain stage, the difference was crossed very easily. And it was crossed very easily because even we today, when we try to explain why and how animals are different from human beings, do not have very clear criteria. 4 legs, well, so 4 legs are good, 2 legs are bad. Don't we all know it from Orwell's Animal Farm? Or 2 legs are good, 4 legs are also good. So that's nothing. We don't have tails. Well, we one used to have it, and everybody knows it. And other than that, there is only one answer to this question. People can speak, and that's a very important thing. Or if you want to go on, people can think, and that's a soggy piece of ground. Do animals think? If they cannot speak, they cannot think? That is not a very satisfactory answer. We will never find out whether animals think. We can only see their reaction. And I don't think that those people whom we in our arrogance call primitive, that they ever distinguished very clearly between themselves and animals. I think the earliest stage of mythology was when all kinds of divine forces were simply ghosts of all kinds, spirits, invisible spirits. Then the second stage, the hunter-gatherer stage, when they were a little bit closer to us than those spirits, in animal shape. And they were indeed indistinguishable from us, therapomorphic - anthropomorphic.
Great, thank you. Well, I know it's past 5. We have a couple more questions, so I hope if you're willing to entertain them, I can ask on behalf of a couple more people.
That is, I'm ready to be here as long as you want me.
Oh, okay, wonderful. So Andy Scheil in English asks, how might Germanic stories of humans who transform into wolves or bears or have wolf-like or bear-like characteristics fit into your lecture? Are such characters meant to have a touch of the divine?
Hard to tell. This is a very good question. And I've dealt with this question to a certain extent when I dealt with so-called werewolves and with all kinds of people who believed that they were bears, which is really a kind of insanity today. And we know a lot about that. And probably everyone, I see that the numbers are diminishing. We were 44 at the beginning, and now only 28. That is, people are either disappointed or busy or have gone home or hungry or whatever. But those who have stayed must have heard everybody, almost everybody knows the word berserk, or berserk pronounced in English. And that is bears - human beings. And there is nothing divine in it. And that is my answer to Andy's question. It doesn't seem that it's divine, that there is any divine grain in this story, but that we are on the same ground or in the same territory. It seems obvious, the territory of non-distinguishing between human beings and animals. And there are many ramifications. That's an entirely different chapter because I don't think there is any divine grain in berserk and in that type of story. They became, it's like running amok when berserks, especially later, fought if we can trust the meager evidence of the stories, naked and in their fury became invulnerable, like gods, really. But these are all, I think, later offshoots of the same non-distinction between animals and human beings. To repeat, I wanted only to touch on only one element of theomorphic gods, rather than all kinds of plots that cross this line. But if I were to write a book about it, the story of werewolves and so on would definitely be a chapter there.
Great, thanks. And a last question from Helena Schmidt, who asked, do animals such as Ratatoskr, there's probably another way to say that, play into this helper archetype, though they are not gods, or the other animals featured in Yggdrasil, the tale you talked about, such as the serpent or the eagle?
Yes, probably. I think that the entire animal world is open to this side of interpretation. Serpents, snakes, snake especially. I mentioned a strange Latvian word. It seems to mean, as I said, a garden snake, but garden snakes or garter snakes, that's the same thing, or garter snakes is very often pronounced in this country. But these creatures do not live at the bottom of the sea. So it's not very clear how they could entice the maiden of the story to live there. And so I think they were eels rather than snakes, and people probably didn't know. And there are all kinds of eels. Eels are very common in the Baltic, so that is why I think that eels are there. And of course, Odin turns himself into a snake. So yes, all animal tales of this type belong together. And I can add what I said a minute ago, that if you cast your net wide, really, animals and human beings and folklore, then you will have several chapters. And the beginning will be probably where I began, with divine frogs or deified snakes, when the line is crossed, and crossed in such a way that there is no way to distinguish between Zeus as a god and Zeus as an eagle. And the choice is huge. Birds, animals, reptiles, anyone. And from this point of view, I think that the mythology and folklore that we find in the New World, which is of course much more archaic than what we have in Eurasia, and many stories, fanciful stories, are at least offshoots of the same, can I use the word which I never use because I despise it, is part of the same paradigm. Paradigm, I think, should remain as the name of our coffee shop. And everybody says paradigm for any reason whatsoever. But it is a kind of pattern rather than paradigm. And as I say, a book on men and mice would have many interesting chapters.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much for sharing this lecture with us and for entertaining questions. And it's been great to see you and to be able to do this again, even though we're doing it virtually and not in person. So we can't now have our reception, but hopefully you will join us next year, same time, and hopefully we can be in person.
So. I hope so too. Thank you very much. To Michelle, who organized it, to Lauren, who made it possible for me to speak and to be heard all over the space, and to those who were not lazy to come and listen to it, and those who were heroic enough to stay until the very end. Thank you very much.
All right. Thank you. Good night.
Goodbye.
Goodbye.